The auction was winding down on a Saturday afternoon in March of 1979, and most of the serious bidders had already left. They'd gotten what they came for, the good equipment, the newer machinery, the stuff that still had shine on it and years left in it. What remained was the junk, or at least that's what everyone called it. Robert Hayes stood in the back of the crowd, catalogue in hand, watching as the auctioneer worked through the last lots. Estate sale for a farmer named Frank Dietrich, who'd passed away at 87. Frank had farmed the same place since 1923, and his equipment shed was a museum of machinery that most people had forgotten existed. "Next up, Lot 47, the auctioneer called out. 1951 Farmall M runs, needs some work. Do I hear 500? Silence. The tractor sat there in the spring mud. Red paint faded almost to pink, one rear tire flat, weeds growing up through the cultivator it still had mounted. It looked exactly like what it was, a 30-year-old machine that nobody wanted. 400? The auctioneer tried. This is a running tractor, folks. Needs a little love, but it's got work left in it. More silence. A few men chuckled. Someone made a joke Robert couldn't quite hear, but it got laughs. 300 to start the bidding. Robert raised his card. The auctioneer saw him, nodded. 300, I got 3. Do I hear 350? Nothing. Going once at 300, twice at 300. The gavel came down. Sold to bidder 92 for $300. As Robert walked up to settle his bill, he passed two men in John Deere caps standing near the cashier's table. Implement dealers from the look of them. Clean boots. Press shirts, even at a farm auction. One of them nudged the other, nodded toward Robert. "That's the guy," he said, not quite whispering. "Hayes, bought another old Farmall." "Another one?" The second dealer laughed. "How many of those pieces of junk is he running now?" "This makes 2, I think, maybe 3. I don't know how he expects to compete farming with equipment that should be in a scrapyard. He doesn't compete. He survives. Barely. Give him a few more years and he'll be having one of these sales himself." They both laughed. Robert kept walking, paid his $300, got his receipt, and went home to figure out how he was going to get that Farmall running again. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about a man who was too cheap to buy good equipment. This isn't about being stubborn or old-fashioned or resistant to progress. This is about a farmer who understood math better than the dealers who were laughing at him. And by the time this story's over, you're going to see exactly why those dealers stopped laughing. If you want to hear more stories about farmers who survived by thinking differently, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear might change how you think about equipment debt and what it really takes to make it in agriculture. Let me take you back 6 years to where Robert Hayes' strategy really began. It was 1973, and Robert was 31 years old, farming 280 acres he'd bought in 1968, with money he'd saved working construction and doing custom harvesting for other farmers. He'd gone into farming with his eyes open, knowing the odds weren't great for a guy with no family land and no inheritance. His first tractor was a 1953 Farmall Super M he'd bought for $1,200. Good machine. Solid. He'd spent 2 months rebuilding the engine, replacing seals, getting everything tight and right. And for 5 years, that tractor had done everything he needed it to do. But by 1973, Robert was starting to expand. He'd been able to lease another 160 acres from a neighbor who was retiring, and one tractor wasn't quite enough to handle the increased workload efficiently. So he had a choice to make. He could do what most farmers did, go to the implement dealer, trade in his old Farmall, finance a new or newer tractor, something with more horsepower, more features, more capabilities. Or he could do something different. Robert spent a week running numbers. He sat at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator, and he worked through every scenario he could think of. If he traded the Super M and financed a newer tractor, say a 5-year-old John Deere 4020, he'd be looking at payments of around $300 a month for 5 years. That's $18,000 total, with interest, plus higher insurance, plus the risk that if something major broke, repair costs on the newer machine would be significant. Or he could buy another old Farmall for $1,000 or less, spend a few hundred in parts and a few weekends getting it running right, and own it outright. No payments, no interest, no financial risk beyond his initial investment. The math wasn't even close. "You're going to buy another old tractor?" his wife Linda had asked when he explained his plan. "I am. People are going to think we can't afford better." "Let them think what they want. We're farming for us, not for them." She'd smiled at that, just making sure you know what you're getting into. "I'm getting into ownership," Robert had said, "and staying out of debt." So in the summer of 1973, Robert bought a 1949 Farmall M for $900 from a farmer who was upgrading. Spent 3 weeks rebuilding the carburetor, replacing the clutch, going through the electrical system. When he was done, he had 2 tractors that could handle his 440 acres, and he didn't owe anybody a dime for either one. His neighbors noticed. At the feed store, at the co-op, at church, people talked. Some of it was respectful, acknowledging that Robert was thinking smart about costs, but a lot of it wasn't. Hayes is farming like it's 1950. Can't afford modern equipment. Going to work himself to death with those old machines. The implement dealers were especially vocal. John Deere, International Harvester Case, they all had salesmen working the territory, and they all saw farmers like Robert as problems. Guys who weren't participating in the upgrade cycle. Guys who were showing other farmers that you didn't need the newest equipment to make it work. "Those old Farmalls are time bombs," one dealer told a customer within earshot of Robert. "They'll nickel and dime you to death in repairs. False economy. You save a few thousand up front and lose it all in downtime and maintenance." Robert didn't argue, just kept farming. The oil crisis hit in October of 1973, and suddenly diesel prices tripled. Farmers who'd planned their budgets around cheap fuel were scrambling. Big tractors with powerful engines were burning 50, 60, 70 gallons a day during peak season. At the new prices, that added up fast. Robert's 2 Farmalls, with their smaller engines and simpler designs, were sipping fuel by comparison. His total fuel costs went up, sure, but nothing like what his neighbors were experiencing. Then came 1974 and 1975. Wheat prices crashed. Input costs stayed high. Farmers who'd been marginal on their finances before were suddenly underwater. Equipment payments they'd been able to cover when times were good became impossible when times were tight. The foreclosures started. First 1, then 3, then 7 farms in Roberts County went under between 1974 and 1976. Good farmers, hard workers, guys who'd done everything the experts and the dealers and the banks had told them to do. They'd expanded, they'd modernized, they'd financed new equipment to increase efficiency and production. And when the markets turned, when the economy shifted, when the costs outpaced the income, they lost everything. Robert watched it happen and felt sick. These were his neighbors, his friends, people he'd grown up with, gone to school with, farmed alongside, and he knew deep in his bones that the only difference between them and him was debt. They owed money on equipment. He didn't. When their income dropped, they couldn't cover their payments. When his income dropped, he just tightened his belt and kept going. That's when Robert made a decision that would define the rest of his farming career. He would never, ever finance equipment again. Not new equipment. Not used equipment, nothing. If he couldn't pay cash for it, he wouldn't buy it. Let me stop here and ask you something. How much of your stress, your worry, your sleepless nights comes from owing money? How much of your life is shaped by payments and interest and debt? Drop a comment and tell me, because this is the question Robert Hayes answered, and it's the question that separated him from the farmers who lost everything. By 1979, when Robert bought that second Farmall M at Frank Dietrich's estate sale, He'd been farming debt-free on equipment for 6 years. His 2 older Farmalls were running strong, well-maintained, never giving him more trouble than he could handle with a weekend and some basic tools. But his lease had expanded again. Another neighbor retiring, another 80 acres available. And Robert knew he needed a 3rd tractor to efficiently cover the ground. The 1951 Farmall M he'd just bought for $300 was a project, no question. But it wasn't a complicated project. He could see what it needed: new tires, some engine work, electrical troubleshooting, general cleanup and maintenance. He spent April and May of 1979 bringing that tractor back to life, evenings after field work, weekends, early mornings before dawn. He pulled the engine, rebuilt the top end, replaced bearings, cleaned and gapped the points, rewired the charging system. He found used tires at a salvage yard for $80, bought gaskets and seals and small parts for another $120, spent $40 on paint, and made the tractor look presentable, not show quality, but respectable. By June, when wheat harvest rolled around, Robert had $500 invested in that 1951 Farmall M, and it was running as good as the day it rolled off the assembly line. 3 tractors, total investment over 6 years, maybe $3,500. His neighbor, a farmer named Greg Patterson, who'd bought new equipment in 1974, had over $40,000 in tractor debt alone. Still owed $32,000. Was paying nearly $600 a month in equipment payments. Robert was paying $0. The years rolled on, and the pattern held. When Robert needed a grain drill, he bought a used one for $400 and spent 2 weekends refurbishing it. When he needed a bigger disc, he found one at an auction for $350 and replaced the bearings himself. When his 1953 Super M finally needed a complete engine overhaul in 1982, he did it himself over the winter, bought a rebuild kit for $800 and had it running like new by spring. Every piece of equipment Robert owned was paid for. Every machine could be fixed with basic mechanical knowledge and standard parts. Nothing was computerized. Nothing required dealer diagnostics. Nothing tied him to a system designed to extract maximum revenue from farmers. He was independent in a way that most modern farmers couldn't even imagine. And that independence gave him something more valuable than efficiency or horsepower or technological advantages. It gave him survivability. In 1984, a young farmer named Scott Brennan came to Robert looking for advice. Scott had inherited his father's farm, 200 acres, free and clear, but nothing to farm it with. His father had sold all the equipment before he died to pay medical bills. "Everyone's telling me I need to buy new," Scott said, "or at least finance something newer. The dealers are saying I can't compete with old junk." Robert was working on his 1949 Farmall at the time, replacing a hydraulic line. He didn't look up. Compete with who? The big operations. The guys farming thousands of acres. "You're never going to outproduce them," Robert said, tightening a fitting. "You've got 200 acres. They've got 10 times that, but you can outsurvive them." How? By not owing money. Robert stood up, wiped his hands. "You know how many farmers in this county have gone under in the last 10 years? Scott shook his head. 19. 19 farms foreclosed or sold under pressure. You know what they all had in common? What? Debt. Every single one. Equipment debt, land debt, operating debt. They borrowed to expand, borrowed to modernize, borrowed to compete. And when the markets turned, or the weather failed, or costs went up, they couldn't service the debt." Robert walked over to his 3 Farmalls, lined up in the machine shed, all of them old, all of them showing their age, all of them running. "These tractors aren't worth $10,000 combined if I sold them tomorrow," he said. "But they don't owe anybody anything, which means I can farm through bad years. I can survive low prices. I can handle drought or hail or whatever comes because my overhead is almost nothing." He looked at Scott. The dealers are going to tell you that new equipment will make you more efficient, more profitable, more competitive. And maybe they're right. But they're not going to tell you that it'll also make you more vulnerable, more dependent, more likely to lose everything if conditions turn against you. Scott stood there thinking, so what do I do? Buy old equipment for cash. Learn to fix it yourself. Keep your costs low. Build up your savings. And when you've got enough cushion that a bad year won't break you, then you can think about upgrading, but not before. Scott took Robert's advice. Bought 2 old Farmalls and a full set of used implements for under $5,000. Spent 6 months learning to maintain them. Started farming. 10 years later, Scott owned his farm debt-free and was leasing another 300 acres. The dealer who'd told him he couldn't compete with old junk had gone out of business. By 1990, Robert Hayes had been farming for 22 years. He'd survived the crisis of the 70s, the farm crisis of the 80s, multiple droughts, hailstorms, market crashes, everything agriculture could throw at a farmer. And he was still standing. Still farming his original 280 acres, plus the leases he'd picked up. Still running equipment that most people said shouldn't work. Still making a living, raising his kids, staying independent. His 3 Farmalls had been joined by a 4th, a 1954 Super H. He'd bought at an auction for $400. All of them maintained. All of them reliable. All of them paid for. The implement dealers weren't laughing anymore. Because while they'd watched customer after customer get buried by equipment debt and lose their farms, Robert Hayes kept showing up every year, kept planting, kept harvesting, kept proving that their model wasn't the only way. In fact, it wasn't even the best way. Here's what I need you to understand, and this is critical. The implement dealers and the banks and the input suppliers, they all benefit from farmers staying in debt. They benefit from the upgrade cycle. They benefit from farmers believing they need the newest, biggest, most powerful equipment to succeed. But Robert Hayes proved something different. He proved that ownership trumps efficiency, that independence beats technology, that survival matters more than productivity. If you're getting value from this story, if you're starting to see farming and equipment and debt in a different light, do me a favor and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the message Robert lived isn't just about tractors, it's about freedom. The defining moment came in 1993. There was a dinner at the County Farm Bureau, one of those annual meetings where farmers got together to discuss policy and markets and the state of agriculture. Robert didn't usually go to these things, but Linda had convinced him they should make an appearance. During the social hour before dinner, Robert found himself standing near the bar with a group of farmers and one of the regional John Deere dealers, a man named Phil Morrison, who'd been working the territory since the late 70s. Phil was holding court, talking about the newest line of tractors, the technology, the features, the competitive advantages. Farming today isn't like it used to be, Phil was saying. You need the right tools to compete. GPS guidance, variable rate application, integrated data management. The farmers who embrace this technology are the ones who'll survive the next decade. One of the younger farmers, a guy in his 30s, spoke up. What about guys like Robert here? He's been farming with old equipment for 20 years, doesn't seem to have hurt him. Phil smiled, not a mean smile, but condescending. The kind of smile that says, I know something you don't. Robert's an exception, Phil said. He farms small. He's not trying to maximize production or efficiency, and that's fine for him. But it's not a scalable model. It's not how modern agriculture works. Robert took a sip of his drink, didn't say anything. See, the thing is, Phil continued, farming today is about leverage. You use borrowed capital to increase your production capacity. You invest in technology that multiplies your efficiency. You scale up to stay competitive. That's how you make real money in agriculture. That's also how you lose everything, Robert said quietly. The group went silent. Phil turned to look at him. What? That's how you lose everything, Robert repeated. Leverage and scale and borrowed capital. That's how most of the farmers in this county who've gone under in the last 20 years lost their farms. Phil's smile tightened. That's an oversimplification. Is it? How many of the farms that foreclosed between 1980 and 1985 had new equipment? How many had expanded on credit? How many had followed exactly the strategy you're describing? Phil didn't answer. I'm not saying your tractors aren't good machines, Robert continued. I'm saying the business model you're selling is designed to benefit dealers and banks, not farmers. You want us in debt because debt creates dependence, creates a captive customer base, ensures we keep coming back. That's not fair, Phil said. Maybe not, but it's true. Robert set his drink down. I've watched good farmers lose everything because they believed what the dealers told them, that they needed bigger, needed newer, needed more power and more technology and more capacity. And when the markets shifted or the weather failed, all that leverage crushed them. He paused. I'm still farming because I don't owe anybody anything. My tractors are old, sure, but they're mine, and nobody can take them away from me. The room had gotten very quiet. Phil Morrison didn't have a response. He just nodded, made an excuse, and walked away. One of the older farmers in the group raised his glass to Robert. Well said. That conversation marked a shift. Robert Hayes stopped being the eccentric guy farming with old junk and started being seen as something else, someone who'd figured out a truth that the industry didn't want farmers to know. Young farmers started seeking him out, asking questions, wanting to learn not just how to maintain old equipment, but how to think about farming as a business instead of a treadmill of debt and production. Robert taught them what he knew, how to evaluate machinery, how to do preventive maintenance, how to troubleshoot problems, how to buy at auctions, how to negotiate with parts suppliers. But more importantly, he taught them how to think about costs and revenue and sustainability, how to build a farming operation that could survive bad years, how to resist the pressure to expand and modernize and leverage, how to farm free. Robert Hayes retired from active farming in 2005 at the age of 63. He leased his land to one of the young farmers he'd mentored, a guy who was farming 400 acres with equipment he owned outright. The 4 Farmalls were still running, still working, still proving that old equipment, properly maintained, could outlast the modern machines that were supposed to replace them. Robert spent his retirement doing custom mechanical work for farmers who couldn't afford or didn't want to use dealer service. He became the guy you called when you had an old tractor that needed rebuilding or a vintage combine that needed parts. He never got rich, never farmed thousands of acres, never won any awards for production or efficiency. But he'd done something more important than any of that. He'd survived, while implement dealers and banks and input suppliers got rich off farmers who couldn't break free from debt. Robert Hayes had built a life and a farm that nobody could take away from him. In 2018, Robert agreed to do an interview for a farming podcast. The host asked him to summarize his philosophy, to explain in simple terms what had made his approach work when so many others had failed. Robert thought about it for a long moment. I think most farmers are trying to make as much money as possible, he finally said, which sounds reasonable, but it's actually the wrong goal, because the pursuit of maximum profit is what drives you into debt, drives you to expand beyond what's sustainable, drives you to take risks you can't afford. What's the right goal? The host asked. Survival, independence, ownership, building something that can weather storms. Robert paused. If you can survive long enough, if you can stay independent long enough, if you can own your operation long enough, profit takes care of itself. But if you prioritize profit over survival, you eventually lose everything. And the old Farmalls, the used equipment, that was just a means to that end? Exactly. The tractors were never the point. The point was staying out of debt. The point was maintaining independence. The Farmalls were just the tool I used to achieve that. The last time anyone saw all four of Robert's Farmalls together was at a farm show in 2019. Robert brought them all, lined them up, and let people look at them, climb on them, ask questions about them. A young farmer, couldn't have been more than 25, stood looking at the tractors for a long time. Finally, he turned to Robert. "Mr. Hayes, I've got a question. Everyone tells me I need modern equipment to make it in farming. That old stuff like this can't compete. But you made it work for 40 years. So what's the truth?" Robert smiled. "The truth is that competition is the wrong framework. You're not trying to beat other farmers. You're trying to survive the industry that profits from keeping you in debt. And these tractors helped you do that? These tractors represent a choice I made a long time ago. To value ownership over appearance, independence over efficiency, survival over growth." Robert ran his hand along the hood of his 1949 Farmall M, the one he'd bought 50 years earlier for $900. "The implement dealers laughed when I bought my second old Farmall," he said, "and my third, and my fourth. They said I couldn't compete, said I was living in the past, said I'd be out of business in a few years." He looked at the young farmer. "But I'm still here, still farming, still independent, and most of those dealers are gone. So who was right?" The young farmer nodded slowly. "I think I understand." "I hope you do," Robert said. "Because the pressure to modernize, to expand, to go into debt, it's never going to stop. It's built into the system. And if you can't resist it, if you can't see through it, it'll take everything you have." Robert Hayes is 81 years old now. He still lives on the same farm he bought in 1968, still works on tractors in his shop, still teaches young farmers how to maintain old equipment and stay out of debt. The four Farmalls are still there, still running, still working on the farm that's leased to his former student. And somewhere in southern Kansas, in implement dealerships and feed stores and coffee shops, farmers are still arguing about whether old equipment can compete with new. But Robert Hayes isn't arguing. He's just living proof. So let me ask you one final question, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments below. Would you rather have the newest equipment and be in debt, or have old equipment that's paid for and farm with complete independence? Because that's the choice Robert Hayes made. And 40 years later, he's still farming, while the dealers who laughed at him are long gone. Think about that. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about farmers who survived by thinking differently, who understood that the game is rigged, and the only way to win is to refuse to play by their rules. I'll see you in the next one.